Hello, everybody. I hope you can hear me all right, and I want to welcome the participants as well as the speakers on this panel. We have a global audience at this time, so I'll say good morning, good afternoon, good evening to wherever you are, and we welcome you to this panel discussion, which is on a very important subject of interest across the world. We're going to be talking today about the reimagining of healthcare and how could we make healthcare better for the population of the world. My name is Sanjay Bonde, and I am the CEO of Trade Capital Corporation based in Menlo Park in California. And our platform delivers capital efficient supply chains to all industries, and we would like to see our clients be more efficient as well as innovative in their business. So let me take the privilege of introducing to you our impeccable audience as well as our speakers at this time. We could not have had a better set of speakers. So I want to welcome Congressman Jim Greenwood. He represented Pennsylvania's 8th Congressional District from 1993 to 2005. As a congressman, he has spearheaded healthcare and environmental leadership. He chaired the House Energy and Commerce Committee's subcommittee on oversight and investigations between 2001 and 2004, leading to notable investigations and reforms. He also served as the president and CEO of BIO, a global biotechnology trade association between 2005 and 2020, and currently chairs DLA Piper's Life Sciences Policy Group. I want to welcome you, Jim, to the session.
Thank you for having me, Sanjay.
Thank you very much. I also want to now take the opportunity to welcome Abraham Verghese, who is the Vice Chair of the Department of Medicine at Stanford University School of Medicine. He is a distinguished author, and I suppose many of you may have already read his previous book, which was Cutting for Stone, and the latest book, which is The Covenant of Water, which has had several bestseller reviews for 7 months, I suppose, for now, and is in Oprah's book club pick. So I want to welcome you. And thank you for joining us, Abraham.
Thank you so much, Sanjay.
I welcome also Gurpreet Dhaliwal, the Distinguished Professor of Medicine at the UCSF at UC San Francisco, and he oversees internal medicine clerkship at the San Francisco VA Medical Center as well. He focuses on understanding cognitive processes in diagnostic reasoning and clinical problem solving with his expertise in diagnostic processes. So we have, you can see, a good set of speakers here. It has been our objective to be able to look at this whole subject from 3 pillars: a pillar associated with policy, strategy, and governance. And Jim, you have great insight onto this, so we would look forward to your inputs. We're also going to look at the patient and bedside expectations and experiences. Abraham, if you can help us deal with that subject, that would be excellent. And Gurpreet on the innovation of healthcare as well as the developments underway. I want to say that this session is being recorded, so you would have the ability to look at this recording later on in snippets or on YouTube as well. The session will run for about 45 minutes with 15 minutes for Q&A. So you please, if you have any questions from the audience, do use the chat box and send in your questions or comments, and we will welcome them. We will now begin also with a very quick introductory remark. And I would like to ask Jim, the question regards the changes that are underway. There are so many different changes underway in the spectrum of healthcare. And with this, how do we as a country compare with the world? If you can shed some light on the biopharmaceutical industry and the position that US has at this time and why we are where we are.
Sure. Well, we lead the world. On average, 57% of the biologics and small molecules, the biopharmaceuticals that are innovated in this country in the world are innovated in the US. So we innovate more drugs than the rest of the world combined. And there's a reason. And in fact, many of the drugs that are innovated in Europe and Asia are innovated for our market. So our market really drives innovation to a very significant extent globally. So why is that? It's been a combination of activities, ongoing activities by the government, mostly the federal government, and by the private sector. The United States created the United States Congress created the National Institutes of Health, the largest funder of basic research in the world, $45 billion a year appropriated by Congress for the NIH, and 83% of that goes into direct grants to academic institutions, 50,000 competitive grants a year, and supplying funds for 300,000 researchers around the country. We have small business innovation grants, in which small businesses can get money from NIH and from other sources federal in the federal government to get started and get over the valley of death that occurs as these small biotech companies are starting out. Over 100 years ago, we created what is now the FDA to make sure that all of the biopharmaceuticals that are approved for the marketplace are both safe and efficacious. And that's been critical. We have the Bayh-Dole Act, which was written in 1980, that allows the universities that develop intellectual property from the research, the funds that they get from the NIH, to then license out those patents to small companies who can spin out and then develop the product. We have the Orphan Drug Act to make sure that small diseases that affect a small number of people are still worthy of investing in treatments for those things. We have the Hatch-Waxman Act that'll make sure that once a drug is approved, it has a fixed number of years, relatively fixed number of years, until the generics can compete, and that drives competition. But on the private side, which is where all the drugs actually get developed in these private companies, the thing that has really enabled us to lead the world is because we have the closest thing to a free market. And that means that the companies who succeed in the very difficult enterprise of developing these drugs can get a financial reward sufficient to continue to attract investment. And so that is critical. And for the most part, we've done that without price controls. And there's some concerns about that in terms of affordable accessibility of these products, which we can get into a little bit later. But for all of those reasons, we lead the world. And if we can not administer price controls on these products, we'll continue to lead the world.
That's an excellent synopsis, and I actually welcome that. I have also listened to your speech at the Oxford Center and cannot more concur that I think the way the capital is deployed will deliver innovation and efficiencies in the sector. That's how the system rewards those who take extreme risk. And also there is a method to be able to deliver cost-efficient healthcare to the population at large. And we could be a little bit more efficient at that for sure. With that, I would turn my attention to Abraham. Abraham, you've also spoken about this subject at one of your TED Talks about the bedside care, about how should doctors look at patient care and experience and the compassion with which you approach a patient. Would you talk to us a little bit about your observations from your vantage point?
Yeah, thank you, Sanjay. I think, throughout my career, I've been very interested in the patient experience of healthcare and the physician experience. And I think, it's easy to forget in the midst of all this innovation and tremendous development of technology that medicine remains a very human-to-human encounter. That this is not a disease manifesting in a machine. It is actually a human being reacting very uniquely to a disease. And I think that is under threat, even though this idea is unchanged since antiquity. The sort of abundance of things that we are doing is actually minimizing our time with the patient. William Osler, a very famous name in medicine, said many years ago, Osler died in 1917, he said, it's not important to know what disease this patient has, but what patient has this disease. So my focus has always been on making sure we are getting to know the individual, making sure that their needs, their unique needs, are satisfied. And, that takes one-on-one at the bedside sort of interaction. And it's very much under threat. There are both opportunities and more risks ahead. So I think that, I've always seen my role the last decade or more as being trying to make sure that many of these innovations don't actually further impact our ability to have this human connection with the patient.
It's incredibly important and deep for us to understand. And there's also a young population of doctors that are coming into the society now. As I think senior doctors retire, there's a whole plethora of young and talented doctors that are appearing, and they are more tech savvy. They're also, the Generation Z will enter into the medical profession, and they are very data as well as computer and system savvy. So we're going to get more of that population, which takes our attention to Gurpreet. Now, customized care, personalized care, telemedicine, using AI, all of these abilities are at the other end of the spectrum to what Abraham just talked about, which is compassion, care, knowing the patient, and then obviously getting deeper with the use of technology. Would you comment on what gets you excited and going in the field that you are?
Yeah, I'm happy to, Sanjay, and I appreciate this opportunity to be here. I think all those technological innovations that you mentioned are exciting. But if you were to ask me, and I'm speaking on behalf of many, many healthcare workers, like what I love about being a doctor is probably the same thing that I loved 25 years ago when I started at it. If you think like what motivates someone to come to work, it rarely will be technology. There's sort of pillars. Daniel Pink outlined this in a book over a decade ago, that oftentimes we're motivated if we have an occupation that allows us to have autonomy, mastery, and purpose. And when I think of most healthcare professionals, and maybe I can speak more specifically about doctors, we have that, and I'm incredibly grateful for it. A job where, if not full autonomy, there's a lot of agency in what we do to help another human being. That mastery, whether it's traditional troves of medical knowledge or the new technology, we're always learning. And then the purpose is almost baked in, helping another human being. And the purpose can come at the bedside, sort of one-on-one, or it can be part of the institution that you're with. I work at the VA hospital, and when you walk in our front lobby, there's a sign and it says the price of freedom is visible here. And so when you see that, it reminds you what you're doing and why you're doing that. And I think the opportunity to work in that type of environment, to say nothing of the wonderful people I work with, like the teams and the stories that I hear from them, are what make me excited. And the technology is just a footprint on that backdrop, or a footnote on that backdrop.
Thank you for those inspiring words, and it's very heartening to know that we still have the conscience intact in the faculties that we all care about. So with this, I want to go back to Jim, and Jim, in terms of policies and procedures, we're looking at a lot of impact that's likely to be caused by several decisions that happen up the hill in Congress, and that could potentially either impact or accelerate innovation. And we know that venture capital firms, PE firms, all of those that support are closely looking at what those are. Would you comment to us about what the overall strategy and the governance expectations might be with regard to the biopharma industry?
Sure. So to innovate a drug is, as I mentioned in my first response, is an extraordinarily chancy enterprise. 90% of the projects that biopharmaceutical companies initiate fail at great expense. And it can cost anywhere from hundreds of millions of dollars or $2 or $3 billion to develop a drug. And sometimes much of that money is spent and then the drug just doesn't work, or something happens and it can't be utilized. And so, and that is why, because of that failure rate, if we expect to continue to have venture capitalists and others and other investors assume this risk, there has to be a very significant return on that investment. And that means that the prices can be high. Now, the problem with that is, of course, that if you go into a drugstore and you go to pick up your kid's medicine and you can't afford it, you're very angry, and as well you should be. So there is a problem of affordable access. Now, in my mind, there are two fundamental causes of this. The first is what we have the PBMs, the pharmaceutical benefit manufacturers, and managers, I should say. It used to be, when they started out some decades ago, the idea was, okay, we're going to use group purchasing power. And so these PBMs would represent large employers, self-insured employers, in some cases insurance companies. And they might say, okay, company A, B, and C, you each make a drug that's pretty much the same. I'm going to put one of those on the formulary for these millions of people I'm representing here. So whoever gives the lowest price wins. And it was a pretty good system. It evolved, or I should say, devolved into a system where now they say, okay, company A, B, and C, you all make a similar drug. I'm going to put one of them on my formulary. So whoever raises their price the most, and thereby can give me the biggest rebate to put in my pocket, that goes on the formulary. So it is a perverse effect. And if you look at the graph, you always hear the reports of skyrocketing drug prices. The list price of drugs has been going up. It's driven by the PBMs, but the net price has been pretty flat for about 10 years, only single digits up and down. And so the Congress is beginning to look seriously at PBM reform, and they should. The other thing that happens is we have too much in the way of out-of-pocket costs. And that means that what often happens is employers are providing health insurance for their employees. The insurance company comes and says, well, the premium is going to go up X%. And the employer says, I can't afford that. What can I do? Well, you can raise the deductible. And so the deductibles keep going up and up and up. Well, if you have a $2,000 or $3,000 or more dollar deductible and you go to the drugstore, you have to pay pretty high price for drugs out of your pocket. And so that should be fixed. Congress took a good step with the Inflation Reduction Act in putting a $2,000 per year cap on Medicare out-of-pocket costs. That's a good thing. I think it should be expanded to the private sector. And the private insurance companies should be told you can have a deductible, but you can't apply it to drugs because people don't have a choice. If they're sick and they need medicine, they need to get that. This is not an optional choice. So those two things are absolutely critical. And I'll end with this. In all the time I've been doing this, I've come up with two what I think are important moral principles. The first is that no patient that should ever go without the drug that he or she needs because they cannot afford what's required to come from their pocket. That should just never happen. It's immoral. So we should make sure that that does not happen. And the second thing is directed at policymakers. Any policy that disincentivizes investment in medical innovation should be unacceptable. Because while the first principle takes care of the people for whom there are medicines, the second principle takes care of people who are waiting for new medicines. And if you disincentivize innovation, you take away the hope of all of those people.
Very eloquently put, and could not agree more. I think we talked about the investment needs that fuel innovation and also the policy changes. This is eye-opening, and I think more of such policy reforms should be brought in, and there are not too many people who could represent it the way that you did. So thank you very much.
And if I may, so just let me add one other thing is that I mentioned the Inflation Reduction Act and the cap on out-of-pocket, but the other thing that it did set price controls in the Medicare system, and that will disincentivize investment. And I believe that the president's going to double down on that tonight in his State of the Union address and call for even more price controls. And that's a problem.
Yes, and we do have an election coming up, so obviously there's going to be a lot of volatility associated with decision making on reform and policies associated with pharma, and everybody would be closely watching it. We do not want retarding policies to be put in place, and I think the capitalist economic character of a country serves us very, very well. It's about the efficiencies that we need to be building in. I sometimes speak about this, if you look at an average automobile vehicle, it actually, if you look at per capita cost that one would put in, is not gone up for the mass consumption cars. You could clearly afford some of these aspects because the industry has been made so efficient. So also are examples in many other areas, such as aviation, for example, or even other industrial manufacturing, where efficiency and innovation both have gone hand in hand. But I think at some point in time, the efficiency, which is to the last mile, could be done better in case of healthcare. That's where I think we need to bridge this gap. And thank you for highlighting that. Gurpreet, if you can talk about, since you're also in the hospital zone, you just spoke about your experiences at the VA and the adoption of technologies. Could you comment on this? And I think with COVID as an experience behind us.
But this is in regards to sort of the adaptation of it. Yeah, I think, when adaptations happen, I work in the emergency room, I work in the hospital, I work in the clinic, and I work in all three places. And oftentimes we are waiting for an innovation to happen. Sometimes they're adopted incredibly rapidly. The COVID vaccine is an example where within months we sort of looked into new technology and said, we will use this because of the circumstances. I think other times doctors are far more cautious. They say if there's something that is a suitable treatment for patients and something is coming that's new on the market that is potentially better but more costly, unknown risk, you can imagine that there's some caution that's taken. And it takes a combination of evidence in the literature. I think thought leaders, particularly in your local space, I think it's not just someone who's an expert out in the world, but someone who you respect in your environment who's also using that new drug or technology to really persuade you to do it. And then finally, a proof of concept where you've seen it once or twice with your own patients or your own colleagues' patients. And that combination is how a doctor shifts from plan A to plan B. We're creatures of habit, not because of any kind of cognitive architecture, but what we're dealing with is high stakes. And so switching to new technology or new innovation requires quite a margin of safety or efficacy before that change is made, particularly if it incurs costs for the patient or the system.
Thank you. Abraham, a lot of this technology and the newer techniques come to hospitals first. You get through a clinical trials process, and then there's an adoption cycle. Can you talk about how your experience has been in adopting new technologies and essentially innovations in biopharma healthcare and the utility of those at the hospital level?
For most of us in medicine, the defining era in our lives is probably going to be this incredible period between 2018 and the present, when COVID arrived and we saw the most incredible speed and rapidity in having the whole genome of this virus, having a vaccine very quickly developed. And just in the period between 2018 and 2022, there were something like 200 biopharmaceutical products that were approved in the US and Europe. It was interesting that not all of them survived, but nevertheless, 200 products, most of them monoclonal antibodies, but also more and more cell therapies. So it's a tremendously exciting era for biopharmaceutical innovation. It has to sort of shake out a little bit. For example, CAR T cell therapy, which is so exciting in many different cancers, I think is being utilized with such rapidity that we haven't really quite grasped the consequences, the fallout. But as Jim was saying, I think the nature of innovation in America, the NIH, the ability of private money to come in and fund these companies has resulted in a tremendous explosion with a challenge for all of us to get our heads around what's out there, how we use it. I mean, just for COVID, the FDA approved 22 different products in a very short span of time, which is astonishing. And it speaks to the kind of pace that we will need for an epidemic like that.
You bring a very important point, which is not only is the innovation engine got to work at full speed, but the adoption engine, like you talked about 22, how can doctors even get to understand the cause effect of all of these drugs and technologies? And how do you bring them in with certain care and be able to monitor the outcomes? And I think COVID, you say, was a fantastic time, a brutal time, but fantastic for us to be able to understand how we could do things better. So it taught us life lessons. Coming back again here, I think, going back to Jim's very first point, I think you're right. The myth has been that the pharmaceutical companies and the medical devices companies are sort of caught as the entities responsible for driving costs up and so on. And sometimes I think they're held as the culprits, and perhaps that's not true. And this is a little snapshot which is run by the internal research team at TCC, at Trade Capital Corporation, where we are. And we looked at a few things. Over the last 3 years, we looked at the amount of inventories that pharma and medical devices companies. So this is a snapshot of about 20 of the largest global pharmaceutical and medical devices companies. That's actually grown up by 25%. So they have to hold more inventories. That is a degree of investment that's incredible. If you look at their revenue, so they are delivering more. So the revenues went up from about 690 to 845, a huge leap there. But their margins compressed, and you can see the compression between 31% to 27%. So they actually lost operating margin, and their free cash flows also went down from 22% of revenues to 18% of revenue. So there is pressure in this segment, and I think there's more to be studied before we sort of label them as the culprits that I think we're generally used to in the public sense, without getting into details. So with this background, we have had an inventory strategy for the country during the COVID times, which proved a little bit less than adequate. Could you talk about how essential commodities and the inventories associated with such an important feature of the biopharma industry should be addressed at the policy level?
And that's for me, Sanjay.
Yes, please.
Thank
you.
So let me put this in two pieces. The first is the National Stockpile, National Strategic Stockpile. It was created in 1998, and we have about $13 billion in medical countermeasures and personal protective equipment that are stored to respond to chemical, radiological, biological events, pandemics, natural disasters. And they are in what they call push packages distributed around the country, so that in the event of any one of those kinds of disasters, these packages can be loaded into a cargo hold of a plane and flown to where they are needed. And we saw some of that during COVID occur. We also saw some of the weaknesses in the system with the COVID epidemic. Then the other issue really is a global issue, and that is, if you look at the active pharmaceutical ingredients, the API that we use to actually manufacture all of these drugs that we innovate in this country, we have a problem with an over-reliance on foreign sources for those materials. Whereas we still make slightly more than half of in the U.S., but there are 72% of the manufacturers of these products are outside of the U.S. Many of them are in China. Many of them are in India. India posed a national ban on exporting these things during COVID, and it was a wake-up call to our vulnerability. And of course, with all of the tension between the U.S. and China, and we saw in China that in the COVID pandemic, that we were relying on China for things like K95 masks and so forth. So the administration and the Congress have looked at ways to actually protect our strategic supply of these kinds of materials. The president created a task force on supply chain reliability. They did a 100-day review, and they came up with a lot of recommendations. So now we have the Council of Supply Chain Resilience, which is set up as a permanent fixture within the federal government, and it relies upon the Department of Energy, the Department of Commerce, Department of Defense, and most of the cabinet members and their staffs to look at supply chain of not only medical supplies, but all kinds of strategic supplies that are critical to our society, to make sure that we are as least vulnerable to any kind of a crisis that would break up that supply and leave us lacking.
You talk about the supply chain inventory and operational elements, geopolitical pressures that impact. These are very similar to other industries. We've seen this in semiconductor industry, for example, where there is a significant stress point at this point about what to do with some extraordinary chipsets. But I think the global nature of pharmaceutical industry, the global nature of the pandemics, the manufacturing locations as well. It brings to bear more and more importance and criticality of driving resilience, not only as a country, but also for each of these corporates that serve their industries need to drive resiliency and efficiency at the same time. Can you be both? And I think the demand now is that you have to be very resilient, efficient, and innovative at the same time. And I think that's a call to order for all of those in the medical devices industry. It's not only going to be pills going forward. There would be other equipment and mechanics of serving healthcare. The medical devices industry is going towards what we call high tech. The amount of semiconductor chips, even those industries use, is going up. And so I think not only APIs, packaging materials, we're talking about semiconductor chips, all of those will need to be fortified and thought about in a very detailed manner to drive resiliency and take out the risks associated with supply chain. With this, I would like to come back to one more question to Abraham. And, from healthcare to running hospitals, and you've been a part of the hospital establishment, not only at Stanford, but also across the board. Are there lessons learned that you can think about when we improve patient healthcare, that there could be some best practices that could be taken into account to run supply chains or other elements better within the confines of a hospital management system?
Yeah, I think, COVID was a revelation for all of us. I'm sure Gurpreet would agree, in the sense that we never realized how very fragile our supplies were. The recognition that for the sake of efficiency, we had become so, not resilient, as you just said. So, for example, the price of hospital gowns had gone up 2,000%, if you could get them. And all of a sudden, from this being a global supply chain, people were sort of dealing with local entities who were promising to supply things. And it's a good thing that people were producing this locally, but it was very hard to somehow systematize who was producing what, how reliable was this. And I think some of the lessons that came out of that was the recognition that, the system could easily be disrupted by pandemic, by war, by this and that, and that, we need more local manufacturing. Hospitals need a one point of contact, because calls were coming in saying, we got gowns for you, but the calls were going to the wrong place very often. We needed quick payouts. So if people are willing to provide you this, you can't have endless red tape. So I think just as the government is recognizing the fragility at a micro level, if you like, hospitals are also recognizing that they need sort of backup systems. They need to be more dependent on local entities. So in a sense, I think COVID has exposed some of our weaknesses, but it's also made us address them much more directly. There is a point person, I would guess, in every single hospital now, whose focus is entirely on this problem.
And Sanjay, if I can just comment briefly on Abraham's comment there. I serve on the thing called the Bipartisan Commission on Biodefense. And back in 2015, we put out our blueprint for biodefense. And we said it's not a question of if there's going to be a pandemic, it's just a question of when it's going to be. And of course, we hadn't had one for almost 100 years then. And so it was hard to get the attention of policymakers. But one of the recommendations we made was that in each major urban area, there should be a triaging of the hospitals. And they should say, okay, this is the hospital that's going to get the first set of patients for a pandemic. And let's forward place PPE and ventilators and medicines there, have them there, and then follow it down so there could be an orderly way to divert the patients to the right hospital, and there wouldn't be this scrambling for equipment and medicines globally, and across the country, states competing against states. So we're just about to renew that blueprint this year, and hopefully the policymakers will pay attention.
Yes, that was now just brought us back to the era that we lived in, and the memories still are very fresh in our minds. So thank you for bringing that up. And I hope that that the resiliency we call supply chain orchestration, or even orchestration resiliency, that starts at the last mile at hospitals to be stitched through all the mechanics in the middle, whether it's distributors and the holding hubs to the manufacturers and their supplies. All of this has to be looked at in better detail, optimized, made resilient, but also retain the innovative character of deploying new technologies. That becomes paramount important. There's also a question that we have received here, and a question which I was going to ask you, Gurpreet, anyway, with regards to newer technologies. You are an internist, an internal medicine doctor, but not everything is internal these days. You've got medical devices, perhaps some of them they go in and some of them stay outside. So, the talking about the white pill, if you will, or other colors or combinations of those, and things such as the use of AI, the use of other technologies that are emerging that are not necessarily from the same realm. Can you talk about what is on your radar? What would you like to highlight or see from your vantage point?
It is hard to capture what's going on in AI, and it's even harder to keep up with it. We are at probably the peak of the hype cycle, but I think even though we're at the peak of it, I think we have moved from some sort of proof of concepts to some things that are actually showing up in the exam rooms now. I think if I may start with the doctor's perspective, many of us are excited by the idea of it perhaps being a diagnostic aid. They have shown examples now where the computer can read an X-ray as well as a physician for certain conditions, like a collapsed lung or a lung tumor, or it can look at a darkening of the skin and give judgment about whether it's a serious form of skin cancer like melanoma or something more benign. And so all sorts of diagnostic tools are being developed. I will say, I think this is a lesson from other industries, that sometimes taking away the thing that the professional loves the most, like the diagnostic process, may not be the best move first, but rather taking care of some operational aspects of the job, which are less fulfilling. Back to that point I made earlier about autonomy, mastery, and purpose. The example that's coming up in healthcare is bringing in the AI into the exam room so the doctor can once again focus on the patient. So regrettably, for the last century, probably decade or so, and Abraham has written about this marvelously with the caricature of the eye patient, the doctor has to spend as much time paying attention to the computer as they do to the patient. Sometimes the balance of it goes to the computer. And now in a couple of Bay Area systems I know, we have a computer listening in and it's creating a note. One of my medical students went to see her preceptor, and the preceptor spent their whole time talking to the patient while the computer was using artificial intelligence to compose the note. And it's amazing to think of a world where that medical student will think that's the way that you interact with the patient again, the way we once did. And even we should take a little bit of the gaze of AI away from the patient and the doctor encounter. I think AI is just going to be a tool for families. I had a patient recently who got their medical records, which now you can get easily, but they're really undecipherable. But they took their father's MRI report of his back and put it into ChatGPT and said, please re-summarize this at the level of a sixth grader. And it gave a beautiful summary that explained the back MRI, probably in a way that I wish I could have done it for him. And so those sort of things on the front end, on the back end, and in patients' homes, we're going to see AI in all of those places. We're just at the beginning of it.
Well, I hope, what you say it comes true, because, I think I was just contrasting this between going on a vacation and checking into a hotel there and applying a logic to checking into a hospital. Our experiences are pretty different. And in one case, it's very petrifying. And the other case is one looking forward to getting to the room, getting to know where your restaurant is and so on. And it's a pretty welcoming part. And I think for all the things that we have done, it shows us what we can do to make sure that the experience which comes at the doorstep of a hospital is something to look forward to get yourself, treated, to get yourself into a better life situation. And I think when somebody visits a hospital, that should be the kind of experience that they should aspire to get. But I think we're far from there. Maybe in some countries, as we've seen, it's possible in preventive care as well as customized medicine and so on and so forth. I think there are a lot of strides that we can make to make this better and an experience that everybody would like to aspire towards. So with that, I think I'm going to ask you a closing question to all three from your vantage points. And the question is the same. I'd like to understand or know from you, what would be the number one change that you would like to see in the system if you were given one choice, if you were running for president and you got to be there in the Oval Office and make a change? I think more likely Jim, but
Okay.
so
Well,
if,
yeah, I like to say that that the progress that biopharmaceuticals, biotechnology is making is just astounding. It's all about understanding life at the cellular level, at the genetic level, at the molecular level, and then using that knowledge to treat and cure diseases. And I say that there are no laws of nature that will prevent us from eventually being able to prevent, treat, cure every disease known to man. But there are laws of man that can get in the way of our ability to do that. And if there's one thing I could change, and I've spent a lot of time trying to make this change happen, is to get policymakers to understand how the system works, and not just always take the cheap shot and blast the pharmaceutical companies as if they're all a bunch of greedy, profit takers, but to really understand how the system works. And how fortunate we are in this country to be able to be the lead innovators. That we saw happen with COVID. It was an amazing process to see how quickly Moderna and Pfizer and other companies were able to develop vaccines against COVID. So that's a precious system. We lead the world. It's a source of great hope. But we just have to get the politics out of it and get a factual understanding by the policymakers of how the system works, so we can work in a win-win way to make sure that innovation continues strongly in this country, and that, as I said, no patient ever goes without the medicine that they need. And I think that's quite doable.
Thank you, Jim. That's a good ask, and I think not an easy one to get to, but I think that ask is very very pertinent with the time of today. So thank you for highlighting that. Abraham.
Well, I think I would like to see more sort of interoperability. You mentioned the ease of checking into a hotel, or a better example, traveling in Europe and using your ATM card. It is extraordinarily difficult to access a medical record from a hospital down the street. I mean, we just have too many barriers. So some of these wonderful innovations just cannot make it across. We really can't summarize the data of every hospitalized patient in the state, in the city, in the country. And if we could, the kind of power we would unleash with that knowledge, I think would be tremendous. But my biggest wish, I suppose, is really for payment reform. We have a lot of perverse incentives now where you are paid to do things to people as opposed to for people. If I stick a needle or a scope or something in you, it's a much higher level of reimbursement than if I spend 45 minutes caring for you. And that affects all kinds of things. It affects the choices medical students make in terms of specialty. I think it affects the kind of care patients receive. If you're coming in to get a heart valve replaced, you are in a different suite and a much more, generally speaking, have a much more comfortable experience than if you're coming in for an exacerbation of your heart failure or asthma. So it's creating perverse incentives that were not intended. But of course, that's a big ask. How do you bring about payment reform? And I leave that to people like our congressmen who really have the savvy to make something like that happen. But it's I hope it happens in my lifetime.
Thank you, Abraham. Thanks for highlighting that. Gurpreet.
Yeah, and I share many of the aspirations that Abraham outlined there. I would just add an observation, which is that although there's much that's good in healthcare, I think we have many deep problems, and they relate to everything from inequity and inefficiencies. But I think one of the things that is disheartening to hear is how dehumanizing the experience is for some patients. There are many patients, despite the best efforts of healthcare workers, that they'll say, like, nobody knows me in the system, or nobody is my quarterback or my guide. They sort of need, like Dante needed Virgil in the Inferno. They need someone with them through this time of trials, and sometimes they're very flat out. They say no one cares, and when you hear that, it's very heartbreaking, and that is a function of the system. If this is something that is not familiar to anyone who's listening in on this, that is wonderful, but you're probably in the minority if those don't apply to you. And so if we can rehumanize medicine, many of the ways we need to do that have been outlined, I think it would just be amazing. it's sort of encapsulated in the idea that when you walk into your doctor's office, instead of the system saying like, what's the matter with you? It starts with a deep understanding of what matters to you. And that's the way we get people better, healthier, and happier. That's my hope for the future.
Thanks, Gurpreet. This was a very nice and vigorous discussion. I think we touched on so many different elements. And I'm going to just summarize. I think education at the policy level, that's huge. I think if we can get our policymakers or decision makers to be better acquainted with the things that you mentioned, and also the entire end-to-end genealogy of the, I use the word genealogy of the healthcare system, I think that would go miles. The second part is also about how the risk and reward mechanics of payments, etc., they work and are applied to determine the right behavior and to be able to support the right behavior that I think can do better for the population at large. And also, I think the ability to figure out what patient care means at the end. Where do you want to spend your time? How do you want to make the experience more enriching for everyone? I think that's really good. I think there's also the disconnects. I see that this is a very diverse chain of command that needs to be brought together, right from preventive medication or preventive practices to what you really eat in the hygiene and nutrition from there on, to policies, to manufacturing, to supply chain and the disparate geopolitical elements that impact manufacturing, to the hospital management system, to the practitioners and the healthcare first responders, to how the system overall takes care of each other through its insurance mechanisms. All of this is a huge canvas, and I think if we can start somewhere and make even a 2 to 5% impact, it will be huge. So thank you for your ideas, and we hope that your aspirations are taken up seriously by the powers that be and be able to proceed forward. With that, I think we will now open up to the questions that we have in the chat. So if I can ask, we've got a few really interesting questions here. Drug shortage seems to have been a big issue in the past few years. What types of innovations are and challenges are driving drug shortages? Do you think drug shortages could be handled? I think I would like to position this question to you, Jim, because we talked about inventories and the national stockpile, but still there is some amount of inventory or some amount of drug shortage that impacts, and there's a long list of waiting queues and things like that.
Yeah. So one of the causes of drug shortage. So I mentioned, I think in my first response, the Hatch-Waxman Act, which basically says that you get a patent, and then you can at a certain point your patent expires, and the generics can come in and compete, and they do. And as it was designed, the price of the drug comes way down when a generic company can come in and compete. And there are frequently 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 generic companies that get the opportunity to make the drug and present it to the patients at a low cost. But then what happens is they compete against one another. The price keeps going down and down and down. And then what happens sometimes is it no longer becomes worth manufacturing it. So you'll see the last generic company just drop out. And then there's no one who wants to make that and distribute that drug at that price. So I'm not sure what the solution to that is, whether it's requires a subsidization by the federal government to make sure that that the price doesn't fall so low that no one wants to make the drug anymore. So that's a big problem. I think one of the things we need is to be able to have hospitals in a system where they can give real-time information through the cloud as to what drugs they're finding getting shortages of, and a central clearinghouse run by the NIH or the FDA, probably the FDA, to monitor that, so that we sort of can see these shortages coming, as opposed to them all of a sudden landing with a thud and there we are, so that we can respond while the drug is still at least available, before it becomes completely unavailable.
Thank you, Jim. There's another question here, which is certain rare diseases never get attention. And what would be a way to get attention to get these remedied? Maybe, would you take a stab at this first one for Gurpreet and give us your ideas about what rare diseases are we are working on, for which we do not have, a determined remedy, and where we should focus our attention and how we could do better.
Yeah, rare diseases is a problem in medicine and healthcare writ large. By definition, any rare disease affects a small percentage of the population. But when you add them all up, and there's a whole society devoted to the definition of this, it's actually a sizable minority of Americans suffer from diseases which we don't have all the diagnostic tools for, and oftentimes, more importantly, don't have treatments for. And I think, with the rise of molecular medicine and precision medicine, there's really a hope that we will find tools for them, but they suffer from some of the same economic forces that Jim mentioned that make it unprofitable for a given company to pursue a drug because of the pipeline that Jim described, and then the competitive forces that come at the end. One thing that I saw, actually, this recently came up in the Wall Street Journal, is the idea of repurposing of drugs for rare disorders. And while this has been of interest forever, I think what's become more plausible is that with the use of AI, we're able to look for solutions that already exist. The FDA, there's roughly about 10,000 rare diseases, and the FDA has approved roughly, I believe, like 20,000 drugs over some time span, or some significant number. And the question, of course, is, could any of these be matched? The Wall Street Journal article, I think, cited a UPenn immunologist who had his own case of Castleman's disease, a rather rare immunologic disorder, and he figured out through brain power and ingenuity that an anti-transplant drug could cure his disease, and he has taken it for 10 years. And now he's started a fund which is going to basically try to use AI and look to see if everything from biochemical knowledge to case reports can repurpose drugs for all of these rare diseases that we don't pay attention to. So perhaps it's the capital markets, or perhaps it's technology that will help us address the rare disorders, but it is an important population.
And Sanjay, I'll comment if I might. I think I mentioned earlier the Orphan Drug Act. Some years ago, 15 or 20 years ago at least, we recognized that if you have these populations of just a few thousand people, that there was no incentive for pharmaceutical companies to spend hundreds of millions of dollars, because you could never recoup that under the current system spread over a small population. So the Orphan Drug Act created further incentives, an extension of patent life and other incentives, financial incentives, to drive innovation into these rare diseases. And it's in large measure, it's been very successful. In fact, there are those who claim that it's too successful, meaning that companies are finding that they want to invest in the rare diseases, the orphan diseases, because there's money to be made there, and sometimes taking away from investment in the large chronic diseases like Alzheimer's and so forth, because they can make more money in the orphan side. So that becomes a problem. And then Gurpreet just talked about repurposing. One of the problems there is that with the Inflation Reduction Act, what happens is, for a small molecule, after 9 years after it's approved by the FDA, it then becomes subject to price controls in Medicare. And for a biologic, it's 13 years after it's been approved. Now, the problem is, it is a common practice and a good practice for companies to see they have a drug and they can now repurpose it for something else. They can invest some money in clinical trials and use that drug for a purpose for which it wasn't initially indicated. But that's going to be thwarted because if you know that you're going to get price controlled before you can ever go through the process of doing clinical trials and repurpose it, the companies can't afford to invest in that. So the initial IRA excludes orphan drugs, but only for a period of a few years, and so we're trying to make sure that there are a number of fixes that we have to make to the IRA so that we don't drive down innovation.
That's a really, really good point. I hadn't thought about that. And I think giving an exclusivity period for repurposed medication could be a way to go for the rare diseases, of course, and new investment in it through the VC channels, etc., is very important and critical to drive outcomes. And one more question. I think this would be the last question we take. Abraham, what would be the message you would want to give to the incoming batch of professionals, the young doctors and practitioners of today?
Yeah, I think they're entering a very, very exciting world. I mean, we've been talking about all the incredible innovations, not just in biopharmaceuticals, but in thinking about the supply chain, thinking about policy, thinking about diagnostics. And yet I would want to remind them of why they came into this. It wasn't to sit behind a screen and solve puzzles. It really was to have the satisfaction of dealing with another human being in distress. Now, people in distress are almost to some degree, in need of reassurance. They're in need of a soothing hand, a knowing hand, a skilled hand who can localize their disease, not on an X-ray, not on an AI prediction, but on their body, on their chest, on their abdomen. And that human aspect of medicine is, to me, the most satisfying. And ultimately, as I said at the start, unchanged since antiquity in terms of human need. And we should try our best not to compromise that.
Thank you. I don't think we could have ended the session with a better comment. Very, very well and lucidly depicted. Thank you very, very much, Jim and Abraham and Gurpreet. This was a wonderful session for those who are online. Wherever you have joined us from, I want to thank you for participating. I hope it was an enriching session for you. It was certainly for me. And the video recording of this would be available on our website, 1tcc.com, and on LinkedIn, etc., or on YouTube. And you would have the snippets of this conversation available to review. So I want to thank you once again. I appreciate your attendance and your time. Thank you very, very much.